She arrived carrying everything her family owed. She left carrying something they never expected her to have. It was a grey November morning in the year 1818 when Cecily Winslow arrived at Redgrave Park with a leather folder containing her father's entire ruinous debt, and a quiet, composed dignity that not one soul in her own family had ever troubled to properly value. Lord Winslow had gambled away the greater part of his modest fortune over the preceding 3 years, first through simple bad luck at cards, and later, more ruinously, through a series of speculative investments arranged by the family's own solicitor, a smooth, careful man named Edgar Sallow, who had structured the loans at terms Lord Winslow, desperate and unwilling to examine the particulars too closely, had never properly understood until the debt had grown considerably beyond any honest hope of repayment. The final note, held now by Barnaby Redgrave, Duke of Redgrave, represented a sum so far beyond the Winslow family's remaining means that Lord Winslow had concluded, in a private family conference some days before, that the only honourable course remaining was to send one of his daughters to negotiate personally with the Duke, to plead for extended terms, or reduced interest, or whatever mercy a powerful man might extend to a struggling family, if the asking were done with proper humility, and, Lady Winslow had added, by whichever daughter's presence might do the family's cause the most good. It was not, the narrator will tell you plainly, Anne or Sophia who was sent, the 2 elder Winslow daughters, celebrated for their beauty and their easy practiced charm, whom Lady Winslow considered too valuable a marital asset to risk in so uncertain and potentially humiliating an errand. It was Cecily, the middle daughter, 23 and quiet, who managed the household's actual accounts in secret because her mother could not be troubled with such tedious business, who had nursed her father through his worst gambling despair without complaint, and who had been told, plainly and without particular unkindness, that her own prospects were modest enough that the family risked little in sending her, rather than a sister with a better match to protect. "You have always had the steadier head for figures, Cecily," her father had said, unable quite to meet her eyes across the family's own worn dining table the evening the decision was made, "and the Duke will find you sensible company, whatever comes of the asking. Your sisters have their own futures to think of." Cecily had accepted the errand the way she accepted most things asked of her within that household, without argument, and without any particular expectation that her own feelings on the matter warranted much discussion. She had spent 6 years, since her 16th birthday and her father's first serious gambling losses, quietly managing what her parents could not or would not manage themselves, reconciling household accounts long past midnight by a single candle, writing careful deferential letters to tradesmen owed money the family could not yet pay, and listening, more than once, to her father's own tearful confessions of a night's ruinous losses, offering what comfort she could while her mother slept undisturbed in the next room, having long since decided such tedious unpleasantness was better left to a daughter with fewer prospects to protect from the association. She had learned in those 6 years to make herself useful and unremarked in equal measure, understanding, with the particular clear-eyed acceptance of a person who has stopped expecting otherwise, that a family's love was sometimes distributed according to a calculation she had simply never been positioned to win. Cecily accepted the errand without argument, as she accepted most things asked of her, and rode to Redgrave Park that grey November morning with her father's ruinous debt in her lap and no particular expectation of mercy, prepared only to state her family's situation plainly and bear whatever response the Duke's own judgment produced. She was shown into Barnaby Redgrave's study with considerably less ceremony than her family's desperate hopes had perhaps imagined. No grand waiting room, no deliberate delay meant to impress upon a supplicant the full weight of a great man's importance, simply a footman's brisk announcement, and an open door, and found the Duke himself, a composed, weathered man of 36, already reviewing her father's file with the particular careful attention of a man who took his own business seriously, regardless of the debtor's rank or desperation. "Miss Winslow," Barnaby said, rising as she entered, "I confess I expected your father himself, or perhaps one of your elder sisters, given the particulars of the situation. I did not expect the family's own account keeper." Cecily went very still, startled that he had guessed, correctly and immediately, precisely what role she truly held within her own household. "How did you know that, Your Grace?" "Your father's own solicitor mentioned it. In passing, some weeks ago, complaining that Lord Winslow's daughter had begun asking rather too many pointed questions about the loan's structure for his liking," Barnaby said. "I confess the detail struck me as considerably more interesting than the rest of the correspondence. A family in your circumstances rarely produces a daughter clever enough to notice when her own father's solicitor has structured a debt to his own considerable advantage." Cecily set the leather folder on his desk with hands that did not entirely obey her composed intention to appear unbothered. "I have come to beg whatever mercy you are willing to extend, Your Grace, regarding my father's debt. I do not have the standing to negotiate terms, only to ask plainly whether some accommodation might be reached that does not entirely ruin my family." Barnaby Redgrave looked at the leather folder a long moment, and then, without further ceremony, took up the note itself and tore it cleanly in half. Cecily stared at the torn document, entirely uncomprehending. "Your Grace, I do not understand. I do not want your father's money, Miss Winslow," Barnaby said. "Quiet," setting the torn pieces down with the same careful deliberation he had used to tear them. "I have examined the particulars of this loan considerably more closely than your father ever troubled to, and I find the terms Edgar Sallows structured are considerably more predatory than any honest lender would extend. Calculated, I believe, to keep your family perpetually indebted rather than ever genuinely repaid, for Sallows' own benefit rather than mine. I have no wish to profit from a scheme I find morally repugnant, whatever legal standing it may currently carry. My own solicitors will confirm the particulars if you wish them examined properly, but I have seen enough this past week to know exactly what kind of arrangement your father was made to sign under duress of his own shame. I am tearing up the note because I find I would rather forgive the whole debt outright than be party to your family's continued ruin at another man's manufactured advantage." Before Cecily Winslow could fully absorb the enormity of what had just been done before her, Barnaby Redgrave asked her father, in a letter dispatched that same afternoon, for something considerably more consequential than any sum of money, and the whole shape of the Winslow family's fortunes, and Cecily's own overlooked place within it, changed entirely in the telling. If a story of a debt forgiven not for profit, but for principle is the kind that keeps you listening, stay, what Barnaby Redgrave asked for instead changed everything that followed. "I have torn up the debt, Miss Winslow," Barnaby said, once her stunned silence had settled enough to hear him properly. "But I find I am not entirely without self-interest in the matter, whatever generosity the gesture might appear. I have watched you, in the space of 10 minutes, demonstrate more genuine competence and more genuine composure than I have witnessed from most society women across a full season of careful courtship. I do not wish payment from your father, Miss Winslow. I wish, if you are willing, permission to court his daughter properly. You, specifically, not whichever sister your mother judges more conventionally suited to the honor." Cecily Winslow sat down rather suddenly in the chair nearest her, the whole morning's careful composure entirely overwhelmed by an offer she had not remotely anticipated. "You cannot mean me, Your Grace," she said, unsteady, her hands twisting together in her lap in a manner she had not permitted herself to show in company since girlhood. "I am not. I have never been considered the family's marriageable prospect. My sisters are celebrated for their beauty and their accomplishments. I manage accounts and hold my father's confidence in matters he is too ashamed to discuss with anyone else. I do not know how to be courted properly, having never once been considered worth the trying. I fear you have made this offer on the strength of a single difficult morning, Your Grace, and I would not have you regret it once the practical particulars of an actual courtship prove considerably less dramatic than a torn debt note. Then I find I shall have to teach you, since I have apparently found the one quality London's whole season entirely overlooked, Barnaby said, with the ghost of a smile that Cecily would come to know, over the following weeks, as considerably rarer and considerably more genuine than any practiced society charm. I do not want a wife who performs accomplishments for my benefit, Miss Winslow. I have watched a great many young women play the pianoforte with technical precision and no genuine feeling behind it, and recite poetry chosen entirely to flatter whichever gentleman happened to be listening. I want a wife capable of managing a great estate's genuine complexity, and I find I have just watched you demonstrate, in the space of one difficult morning, precisely that capacity, along with a composure under genuine duress that no amount of fashionable training could ever properly teach. Lord Winslow, informed of the Duke's extraordinary offer by express letter that same evening, read the letter 3 times through before he trusted himself to believe it, and received the news with a bewilderment that took several days to properly settle into gratitude, for he had sent his least valued daughter on an errand of desperate mercy, and received back, in exchange, both his family's complete financial salvation and a match considerably grander than his most celebrated daughter had ever secured through a full season's careful cultivation. It was Lady Winslow whose reaction proved considerably more complicated. There has plainly been some mistake, Your Grace, Lady Winslow said, calling upon Redgrave Park herself within the week. Arriving with Sophia in tow and dressed, plainly, in her most flattering gown, her composed social manner barely concealing her genuine bewilderment at the whole turn of events. Cecily is a good, dutiful girl, I do not deny it, but Sophia is considerably better suited to a duke's household. Accomplished in music, admired throughout the county for her beauty, trained since girlhood in precisely the graces a duchess requires. I have brought her along today, in fact, so that Your Grace might properly reconsider the matter with the full comparison before you. I confess I wonder whether some confusion of circumstance has led Your Grace to settle on the wrong daughter entirely. There has been no confusion, Lady Winslow, Barnaby said, with a plain firmness that left no room for further negotiation. I have met your daughter Cecily. I have watched her manage a genuinely difficult conversation with more grace and more honesty than most women twice her social training manage across a full season. I do not require music or fashionable accomplishment in a duchess, Lady Winslow. I require exactly the qualities your family has spent 23 years failing to notice in the daughter standing directly in front of you. Sophia herself, standing rather awkwardly through the whole uncomfortable exchange, spoke up before her mother could press the matter further, with a candor that surprised everyone present, including, plainly, herself. Mother, I do not wish to marry a man who has already chosen my sister, whatever his rank, Sophia said. I find the whole business rather mortifying, if I am honest, and I would rather go home than stand here being compared like a horse at auction. Lady Winslow left Redgrave Park that afternoon with her composure considerably more shaken than she cared to admit, and began, over the weeks that followed, the particular uncomfortable adjustment of a mother learning that the daughter she had valued least had, through no scheme or ambition of her own, become the family's greatest asset. Their courtship, over the weeks that followed, grew alongside Cecily's own slow, careful adjustment to being genuinely seen for the first time in her adult life. Barnaby called regularly and found himself, with each visit, increasingly astonished by the sheer breadth of competence a family's careless dismissal had left entirely unexamined. Cecily's fluent understanding of estate accounts, her sharp, practical judgment on matters of household management, a dry, observant wit that had simply never been given proper occasion to be exercised in a household that valued her sister's louder charms above her own quieter substance. You have read my own estate's quarterly reports more thoroughly than my own steward manages, In the space of a single afternoon, Barnaby observed one such visit, watching her work through the figures with genuine, unhurried interest rather than mere polite performance. "I have managed my father's accounts in secret for 6 years. Your Grace," Cecily said. "I find the habit does not easily set itself aside, even when the accounts in question are no longer my own family's desperate concern." "I hope you never do set it aside," Barnaby said. "I find I have been managing Redgrave's own affairs rather too much alone these past years, and I would welcome, considerably more than my own pride generally admits to wanting, a partner capable of genuinely sharing the weight of it." He told her, over the weeks of that courtship, the whole shape of his own solitary inheritance. A father who had died young, leaving him a dukedom at 22 with no proper preparation for its weight, and a mother who had retreated so entirely into her own grief that Barnaby had spent his first years of management learning, largely alone, the whole difficult business of a great estate's genuine complexity. "I have had a great many women perform interest in my ledgers over the years, Cecily, precisely because they understood a duke's fortune to be worth the performing," Barnaby admitted. "One such evening. I have never once, before this month, met a woman who found the actual work of it genuinely engaging, rather than merely tolerable in service of the title attached. I find figures a great deal more honest than most conversation, Your Grace," Cecily said. "A column either balances, or it does not. I have found that a considerable relief. In a household where a great deal else never quite added up the way it was claimed to. Then I hope Redgrave's own accounts prove a worthy diversion," Barnaby said, "though I confess I would rather you found the man attached to them equally worth the diversion, in time." "I am beginning to, Your Grace," Cecily said, and the admission cost her something to make plainly, though she did not look away from him in the making of it. Their conversations grew, week by week, into something considerably warmer than the careful business discussions that had first occupied them. Barnaby, learning the whole particular dry humour Cecily had never once been permitted to exercise at her own family's table, where her mother's preference for her sister's louder charm had left little room for a quieter wit to be properly appreciated, and Cecily learning, in turn, that the composed, weathered duke she had first met across a debt-laden desk carried a genuine warmth beneath his careful formality that 6 years of solitary management had simply never given him proper occasion to show anyone. There came an afternoon, some weeks into that careful, deepening courtship, when the two of them, walking the Redgrave Park gardens in the last of the autumn light, found themselves standing close at the edge of a quiet fountain, neither moving to widen the small distance that had settled between them. "I did not expect, riding here that grey morning with my father's ruin in my lap, to find anything but mercy at best and humiliation at worst," Cecily admitted. "Lo, I find myself, instead, standing in a duke's garden wondering whether I am dreaming the whole of the past month." "You are not dreaming, Cecily," Barnaby said, and reached, careful, to take her hand, his fingers closing warm around hers. "I find myself equally astonished by the whole turn of events, if it eases your own disbelief any. I did not expect, reviewing a tedious debt file on an ordinary Tuesday, to find the one woman I have been genuinely searching for without ever quite knowing how to look properly." His free hand rose, slow and careful, to trace the line of her jaw, and Cecily did not draw back, though her breath caught at the closeness of him. For a long suspended moment neither of them moved to close the last small distance, or to widen it, the whole quiet garden holding its breath around them, the fountain's soft water sound the only thing marking how long they stood there, simply looking at one another. "I find I want to close this distance rather badly, Cecily," Barnaby admitted, low, "and I find myself, for the first time in longer than I care to examine, uncertain whether wanting something this plainly is entirely wise. I have spent 23 years being told, without ever quite being told directly, that wanting things for myself was a luxury better left to my sisters. Cecily said, her own voice unsteady. "I find I am rather out of practice at trusting my own wanting, Your Grace. However much of it I feel standing here with you." It was Cecily who eased back first, breathless, smoothing her skirts with hands that betrayed how little the small retreat had actually cost her desire to remain. "Not yet," she said. "I would like to be entirely certain, when this finally happens, that it is chosen rather than simply the product of one golden evening's proximity, for both our sakes. Then I shall wait, gladly," Barnaby said, though it cost him visibly to say it, and stepped back himself. Though the warmth of that near closeness carried them through the weeks that followed, a promise neither had yet spoken fully aloud. It was Edgar Sallow's own mounting alarm, as the courtship progressed, and his profitable control over the Winslow family's finances collapsed entirely with the debt's forgiveness, that produced the sharpest danger of the whole affair. Sallow had structured the original loan's punishing terms with deliberate care over 3 patient years, skimming a considerable private commission from every renewed arrangement and every extension of the debt's crushing interest, careful always to keep the arithmetic just barely comprehensible enough that a desperate, ashamed man like Lord Winslow would not trouble to examine it too closely, and had in fact been the very man who first suggested to a desperate Lord Winslow that sending a daughter to personally plead the family's case might soften the Duke's judgment, never imagining, in his careful calculation, that the Duke's response would forgive the debt entirely rather than merely extend it further, thereby ending Sallow's profitable arrangement in a single stroke. He had watched, from his own modest office in the county town, the growing talk of a match between the Duke and the Winslows' overlooked middle daughter with mounting private alarm, understanding, with the particular clear sight of a man who has spent years exploiting a family's shame, precisely how thoroughly a genuine marriage would end his own quiet, profitable arrangement, for a Duke's own solicitors, once properly attached to the family's affairs, would examine every one of Sallow's prior dealings with a rigour Lord Winslow's own shame-blinded trust had never once applied. Facing the complete loss of years of quiet profit, Sallow turned to forgery. He produced, some weeks into Cecily and Barnaby's courtship, a second supposed debt document, claiming an additional sum Lord Winslow had allegedly borrowed separately some years before. Complete with a signature Sallow had carefully practiced to match the older man's own hand, and presented this fraudulent claim directly to Barnaby's own solicitors, calculating that a second debt, discovered now, might cast sufficient doubt on the whole Winslow family's financial honesty to threaten the coming marriage before it could be properly settled. It was Cecily herself, examining the fraudulent document with the same careful attention she had once brought to her father's genuine accounts, who first spotted the forgery's telling flaw. "This signature is not my father's, Your Grace," Cecily said, laying the document beside a genuine sample of Lord Winslow's hand. "My father crosses his sevens in a particular fashion he learned from his own father, a small habit I have seen on every genuine document he has ever signed in my presence. This forged claim lacks that crossing entirely. Mr. Sallow has copied the general shape of my father's signature convincingly enough to fool a casual eye, but he has missed the one small habit that would have made the forgery truly complete." Barnaby's own solicitors confirmed the discrepancy within the day, comparing the forged signature against a dozen genuine samples gathered from old estate correspondence, and found Cecily's observation entirely correct. The small, distinctive crossing of the sevens present in every authentic document, absent entirely from Sallow's careful but ultimately incomplete forgery. Sallow was summoned to Redgrave Park to answer the accusation directly, and arrived with the same smooth, practiced confidence that had served him 3 profitable years managing the Winslow family's shame, plainly still believing his careful forgery would withstand scrutiny. "This is a serious accusation to level against a professional man's reputation, Your Grace," Sallow said, when the forged document was laid before him. "I would remind you that Lord Winslow's own memory of his financial affairs has grown rather unreliable these past years, given the strain of his difficulties. I do not say this unkindly. Only that a man in his position might well have forgotten a debt he genuinely incurred. My father's memory is not the matter in question, Mrs. Sallow, Cecily said, before Barnaby could answer, laying the genuine documents beside the forged one with the same careful precision she brought to every account she had ever balanced. The matter in question is a signature that does not match his hand in a particular, consistent detail present in every authentic document he has signed in my presence for the whole of my adult life. You copied the general shape of my father's writing well enough to fool a careless eye, Mr. Sallow, but you did not know him well enough to know the one small habit that would have made the forgery complete. I find that rather telling for a solicitor who has claimed, this past hour, such devoted personal knowledge of my father's affairs. Sallow's careful composure faltered visibly under the weight of so precise an accounting, and when Barnaby's own solicitors confirmed, within the same hour, that the paper stock used for the fraudulent document had been purchased from a stationer only 3 weeks prior, rather than bearing the age the claimed debt's supposed origin required, his denial collapsed entirely. And he attempted first denial, and then, when the evidence proved wholly undeniable, a desperate appeal to the years of loyal service he claimed to have provided the Winslow family, a defense that convinced no one present, least of all Lord Winslow himself, who finally understood, in the fuller telling, exactly how thoroughly his own family's trusted solicitor had profited from 3 years of his desperate ruin. The whole affair, once properly settled, cleared the last obstacle from Cecily and Barnaby's path. It was that same week, with Sallow's scheme fully exposed and the whole family's finances finally, honestly settled, that Barnaby found Cecily once more in his own study, where the torn halves of the original debt note still sat on his desk, kept rather than discarded. I have kept these torn pieces since that first morning, Barnaby said, taking up the torn note. I find I could not quite bring myself to throw them away, though I did not entirely understand why until I watched you catch Sallow's forgery with the same sharp attention you brought to that first difficult conversation. I mean to have these framed, Cecily, as a permanent reminder of the exact morning I refused to let a debt define your worth, and found, instead, everything your family had spent 23 years failing to properly see. Cecily crossed the study to stand beside him, looking down at the 2 torn halves of a document that had once represented the whole of her family's ruin, and her own carefully diminished place within it. I came here carrying everything my family owed, Your Grace, she said, quiet, watching him hold the torn pieces with a care that undid her more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have. I did not imagine, riding through that grey morning with the folder in my lap, that I would leave carrying anything at all beyond whatever mercy you chose to extend. And you are leaving, I hope, carrying something considerably better, Barnaby said, and took her hand properly now, in front of no one but the torn note itself as witness. Will you marry me, Cecily? Not to settle any debt, forgiven or otherwise. Because I have fallen entirely, genuinely in love with the woman my own family overlooked, and mine very nearly did too, before I troubled to look properly. The kiss she gave him then in the quiet study where a debt had first been torn and a whole family's fortunes rewritten, was quiet and certain, and what broke open in Cecily was the plain astonishment of being chosen, at last, not for what she could pay, but for everything she had always, quietly, been worth. Sallow was dismissed from the family's service and prosecuted for the forgery, a conviction that saw him lose his own professional standing entirely and spend the better part of a year in the county gaol. And word of his exploitation of the Winslow family's shame travelled through the county's professional circles with a speed that ensured no respectable family would ever again entrust him with their private affairs, whatever became of him after his release. Lord Winslow, once the fuller shape of Sallow's 3 years' quiet exploitation became clear to him, sat with his daughter one evening in a conversation considerably more honest than any they had shared across the whole of her adult life, and told her, with a plainness that cost him visibly, that he had failed her twice over. First, by burying the family in debt through his own weakness, and second, by never once troubling to notice, across 6 years of her silent management, exactly how much she had carried on his behalf without complaint or thanks. "I do not know how to properly apologize for 6 years of taking your competence for granted, Cecily," her father said. "I find I do not have words equal to the debt, which strikes me as rather a fitting irony, given how the whole business began. You might begin, father, by simply noticing from now on," Cecily said, gently, echoing a sentiment she had once heard her own sisters offer in a different context, and finding it fit rather well regardless. "That costs a great deal less than you perhaps imagine, and I find I have missed being genuinely seen by my own family more than I ever let myself admit." Lady Winslow's own adjustment proved slower, though genuine in its own eventual fashion. She attended Cecily's wedding with a pride she had not fully earned but plainly, by then, genuinely felt, and made a quiet habit, in the years that followed, of speaking rather more carefully about which of her daughter's particular virtues she chose to praise aloud, having learned, at some cost, exactly how much a careless calculation could nearly cost a family it was meant to protect. They were married the following spring at the small church nearest Redgrave Park, and Anne and Sophia, genuinely fond of their sister despite their mother's earlier favoritism, stood as her attendants with real joy, having come, over the winter's unfolding events, to understand precisely how badly their own family's careless calculations had undervalued the sister who had managed their household's survival in silent, unthanked competence for years. Sophia, in particular, sought Cecily out privately before the ceremony to say, with more sincerity than the family's usual polished manners generally permitted, that she was glad, genuinely and without reservation, that her sister's quiet worth had finally found the recognition it had always deserved. The torn halves of the original debt note hung framed in the Redgrave Park study ever after, a small permanent reminder of the exact morning a duke refused to let a family's debt determine a daughter's worth, and found, in the refusing, the truest fortune Redgrave Park had ever properly counted. Cecily continued to manage the estate's own considerable accounts alongside her husband for the whole of their long marriage, and their own daughters, raised to understand plainly the story of the torn note and the mother it had nearly overlooked, grew up believing, long before they needed the lesson stated aloud, that a family's truest wealth was never measured in what it owed, or what it was owed, but in whether it troubled to properly see the people already standing quietly within it.